not to hijack everything, but yeah, it's been very entertaining. My theory is that shark is a resident shark that's been going through since before I saw it, because the kayakers let me know about it. So that's why communication between everyone on the shore is a great thing.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us.
We wanted to record, right?
Oh, yeah, it's recording.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Just a reminder, we are being recorded, and thanks for pointing that out, Nicole, because I just wanted to reiterate that the breakout groups will not be recorded. So we're just recording the main presentation. So you're free to, well, in whatever space, you're free to say whatever you like, but yeah, we're not going to be recording in those rooms. So welcome and thanks for joining us for the workshop. Today is Embedding Equity in Conservation Communication, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists and to seeing what you guys come up with in group discussions. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention it's especially important today for you to have your name, your full name, showing with your little screen. So if you can remember from yesterday, I'll just give you a quick overview. You want to touch the little dot, dot, dot right at the upper right-hand corner of your little square with your face, and you should be able to have an option to rename. Please type your full name in there. If you have pronoun preferences, you can put those in, you can put your affiliation, and that will really help Heather. And everybody say hi to Heather. She's going to be helping again with the tech today. Thank you, Heather. It's going to really help her assigning people to breakout rooms, which we're going to do several times today. And as a reward for those of you that have joined us this chilly morning, we're going to do one more Wheel of Names for a door prize. So Heather, do you want to spin that wheel?
Yeah, can I have the screen share back? I'm going to screen share the wheel. Okay, there we go.
This is again for a Respect Wildlife water bottle or tote bag, your choice. They're really great tote bags, by the way. Well, both are really great, but I especially love the tote bag. Oh no, she won yesterday.
Oh, okay.
Wendy, go buy a lottery ticket.
All right, one more.
And you have to be present to win, by the way. So if we, hopefully we'll land on someone who's here. Karen. Karen, are you here?
I'm here. Thank you guys.
Karen. Karen, I'll send you an email and a link. I'll send you an email and a link to the shop, and then I'll just have your choice sent directly to you. And without further ado, let's get started with today's workshop. And I just want to introduce the hosts that have really done a lot of work in pulling this together and planning this, and they're going to introduce the panelists. So Colleen Young from California Department of Fish and Wildlife, you saw her yesterday. Nicole Palma from MPA Collaborative, and Andy Johnson from Defenders of Wildlife are going to be helping out or facilitating the workshop today. And I'm going to turn it right over to Colleen, who's going to be your host for the rest of the day.
All right, thank you, Jenna, and thanks so much to everybody for joining us. I'm really excited about today's workshop. It's been a real pleasure to work with the panelists to put this together for you guys. And the format of today's workshop is going to be that we're going to start with a series of presentations to kind of set the stage and give you some information that we hope will be really useful to you and applicable in your work. And then the second part of the workshop is going to be breakout rooms where we're going to talk through some scenarios. And I think, everybody on this call is a very respectful and thoughtful person, but I just want to, kind of remind everybody to be respectful of everyone's, anything anybody shares, and it's a safe space. And we're going to be talking about some challenging and difficult topics. So we want to just, respect everybody's opinions and be supportive of everybody. So it is with that, I will introduce the panelists, and it is my pleasure to introduce these three wonderful people. The first one is Jules Jackson, and she is the Wild Coast Outreach and Indigenous Engagement Coordinator based on Kumeyaay land, where she works to conserve our coast and ocean through youth engagement and public outreach. She is also the founder of Coastal Defenders, a water justice nonprofit organization whose mission is dedicated to raising equity in STEAM, environmental stewardship, and aquatics from a decolonized lens that focuses on reclaiming Indigenous land and water stewardship through traditional ecological knowledge and co-management. Jules is expanding on and developing new community partnerships, creating new youth conservation opportunities, and engaging community members, especially from Indigenous and underserved communities, in the conservation of their coastal and marine spaces. Jules grew up at the beach in Delaware as a member of the Nanticoke Nation, and she is a docent at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where she was one of 29 people chosen from 300 worldwide applicants to participate in the Scripps Rady Ocean Plastic Pollution Challenge. Jules has completed research on the Tribal Intertidal Digital Ecological Survey, known as TIDES, which is a partnership between Scripps and the Tolowa Dene Nation, documenting climate change and sea level rise. She serves as the UCSD Mat Lahoyle project and consults on the MPA Decadal Management Review, promoting Indigenous inclusion for our local marine protected areas. Jules studied political and naval science at Villanova University and is the 2022 Association for Environmental and Outdoor Education Southern California Educator of the Year. And I will apologize for probably mispronouncing some of those names, but I appreciate Jules' guidance in trying to help me get them right. So thank you so much to Jules for being here and contributing your knowledge and expertise. Our next presenter, who you'll hear from today, is Erin Loury. She is a science communication specialist, fisheries scientist, and writer. Her experience communicating scientific findings to broad audiences includes news articles and newsletters, social media, video, classroom presentations, and facilitated workshops. For the last 10 years, Erin worked as the communications director and a fisheries biologist at the California-based consulting company FishBio. Part of her role involved working with communities in Southeast Asia to establish, manage, and monitor community-based freshwater protected areas known as fish conservation zones. She also spent 6 years helping to manage communication efforts for the multidisciplinary Wonders of the Mekong project in Cambodia, which seeks to study, communicate, and conserve the unique natural wonders of the Mekong River Basin. Erin holds a master's degree in marine science from San Jose State's Moss Landing Marine Laboratories, where she studied rockfish trophic ecology in Central California's marine protected areas. She also holds a graduate certificate in science communication from UC Santa Cruz and a bachelor's degree in biology from UC Davis. And so welcome, Erin. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. And last but absolutely not least, Nicole Cropper is the Deputy Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where she focuses on coordinating the work of CDFW to embed equity into all activities. Nicole previously was the Special Assistant to the Office of the Commission at the California Public Utilities Commission, where she served as the project manager for the implementation of the Environmental and Social Justice Action Plan and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group. In this role, she coordinated a variety of policy discussions that impact California's most vulnerable populations and/or marginalized communities. Previously, she served as the assistant to Commissioner Reichshoffen, where she supported his efforts on equity, transportation, electrification, affordability, environmental and social justice, and building decarbonization. Before joining the CPUC, she served as an executive fellow at the California Department of Healthcare Services. In a previous life, she owned and managed a small salon in San Diego and concurrently led an organization which addressed health and food access and equities through urban gardening. So thank you, Nicole, so much for being here and sharing your expertise. All right, so each of the panelists are also going to do a kind of a reminder intro for themselves before they start speaking, just in case you weren't here to hear their more extensive bios that I just read. But as you can see, we have an incredible group here, and I am going to have Nicole take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Wonderful. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nicole.
No, wrong, Nicole. Removing spotlight, sharing screen. We're all good. Right, thank you.
Okay, so can we go to the next slide? Probably we're going to skip a couple of slides here. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to talk about a lot first and foremost, but we're really going to focus on kind of the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, provide some foundational definitions, and then talk a little bit about kind of some of the systemic structures in place that have gotten us to a place where a lot of people aren't engaging in the work that we all do today. But before I do that, I would like to just share a little bit about myself, a little bit more about myself, just to provide some context. So, you know, like she said, I have, you know, all of this is my background. But what I think is really interesting is that I don't come from a place, my training is not in science, is not in conservation. But some of these, all of these principles actually of equity, of inclusion really apply no matter what field you're in. And so I want to first put a caveat on that. And then I want to also say that, you know, the importance of diversity is really, I think, highlighted in this group of panelists, right? So Jules with all of her accolades, and Erin with all of her accolades and her extensive background, right? And then myself with, you know, my background and whatnot. And us coming together to be able to create this presentation really exemplifies why diversity is so important, because all of these different perspectives really help us get to the outcomes that we're looking for, you know, to protect wildlife, you know, and to have the public really engage with wildlife in a safe and respectful way. So next slide, please. So I'm going to first provide a couple of just foundational definitions so that we all are on the same page, you know, when we're talking about this work. And so first, diversity. The definition is here, so I'm not going to go through this, but this really just means at a fundamental level, all the different ways that we show up day to day, right? So that's diversity of thought, diversity of appearance, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, cultural background, all of these ways that we show up every day. You know, in this room, I'm sure there's an immense amount of diversity, even though it may not appear so, right? And so diversity really just at a fundamental level means, you know, how different people show up. And the importance of that is that people show up differently. And diversity is definitely, you know, may not always be really visible, right? We are in kind of a racially, we categorize people kind of based off of, you know, racial appearances, but there are, you know, diverse characteristics that may not be visible, like disability, for example, or cultural background, right? Like you may not be able to tell someone's cultural background based upon their appearance. And so it's really important to be, one, aware that there are kind of invincible and invisible characteristics, but also to be sensitive of just the different ways that people show up. So next slide, please. I really love this slide because I also like to distinguish between equality and equity. And I think, you know, certainly coming from the government perspective, you know, we tend to, or previously we tended to use equality and equity interchangeably, but they really are different. And so I think this slide does a really good job of expressing what that difference is. You know, traditionally the government, and I would say, you know, even the private industry, the way that we deliver services and deliver programs is a kind of a one size fits all, right? You can see in this top panel, this photo, you know, everyone receives the same bike, everyone receives the same services. But as we can see, not everyone is able to use the bike the same way, and two, won't have the same kind of health and experiential outcomes from using the bike. And the first person who's in a wheelchair can't even use the bike at all, right? There's someone who is taller. There's someone, you know, on the end who is a little height challenged like myself. And, you know, they're able to kind of use the bike, but it's not the same way. And what we're really trying to get to is equity, so equitable outcomes. So on the bottom panels, you see everyone has a bike that really fits their personal needs. And this is not, I think what often happens when we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, it can kind of seem like preferential treatment. And that's not at all what equity is. Equity really is understanding the needs of the diverse population that we serve, and then providing services based upon those needs. But that requires an incredible amount of intention, and it really requires an incredible amount of listening and understanding and engaging with different types of people. Next slide, please. So exactly what I just said, equity is just really a process of eliminating disparities so that everyone has better outcomes. It has to be intentional. It has to be ongoing. There is no kind of goal for equity, right? You never get a gold star. It's not like, okay, we finally made it. We're equitable everywhere. It is it has to be an ongoing process. We live in a country that was fundamentally founded on principles of exclusion, on keeping certain people out of the conversation, out of decision-making, out of power, out of practice. And so we have to intentionally dismantle those systems. And again, that means reaching out to people who have been disenfranchised, who have faced disparate outcomes, and understanding kind of their world, and then providing, closing those gaps so that their characteristics, kind of their difference, is not a predictor of outcomes. Okay, next slide, please. And so how do we get there, right? How do we get there, based upon this really complicated history, and none of us really participated in it, but, some of us were able to benefit from this complicated history. How do we make that change? And first and foremost, that is kind of addressing and analyzing, kind of your internal and external culture. And what culture is really just kind of how people come together in a group. It's your thoughts, kind of the thought processes, the beliefs, your values, kind of your symbology and how you've agreed upon, language and have accepted as best practices. Like, this is the way we are going to communicate. That is culture. It is kind of this collective agreement in kind of the in-group, in the members' minds that said that we are going to operate in a certain way. And, kind of what we're going to talk about a lot today is kind of, the culture that is kind of dominant, and then the culture where we want to be a lot more inclusive of all the differences of all the people. Next slide, please. And you're going to have to excuse me. I've given like 10 talks this week, and so I'm kind of losing my voice, so I may clear my throat a few times. And so I mentioned in the last slide kind of this dominant culture. And it's also referenced as kind of white supremacy. And that may make people, some people uncomfortable, but really what white supremacy means is this dominant culture. So it can be explicit or it can be subtle. And it's just kind of the norms that we have adopted as a nation, as a state, even as a, city, county, whatever group. These norms and preferences that we've adopted that are really based on kind of a European framework and way of living and way of being. And that really has impacted how we organize our work, how we engage in conservation, how we look at restoration, how we think about community engagement. It's the institutions that we work in, that we play in, that we live in. It's how we see ourselves, right? So kind of having a culture, a dominant culture that may not be reflective of the way that I see myself, and then trying to fit myself into that dominance. It's how we interact with one another. It's how we measure time and think about time, because that absolutely is different among cultures. And then again, how we make decisions. The dominant culture, white supremacy, is really kind of, it has become our measure of doing good or being good. Okay, next slide, please. And so I really love kind of this slide because it does show the different ways that the dominant culture can show up in our work and in our day-to-day lives. And so I work at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and these are a couple of the ones that I've highlighted are a few of the ways that I have seen it shown up in my own work. But I do want to make a caveat that, none of these characteristics are bad, are negative, just kind of intrinsically upon their own, right? I will say, gladly that I am a perfectionist, right? I struggle against that every day. you know, trying to make sure that everything that I do is absolutely perfect. But what, you know, what I talk about these characteristics for is to really analyze, you know, these characteristics, my perfectionism, to see, you know, am I, you know, unintentionally excluding someone because of my perfectionism? Am I making someone else feel like, you know, they're not able to show up or engage with me in a way that is, you know, not honoring kind of their culture and their background because of my perfectionism? I see this definitely in power hoarding, so not sharing information. I really, really, really see it in this like fear of open conflict. You know, there are some cultures that value having discussions, like hard discussions with people. And we have a culture, the dominant culture of, you know, we have to play nice with one another and not have difficult discussions and not be confrontational because, you know, we want to be nice and we're kind of scared of this conflict. But that is kind of, again, that's a trait of kind of this dominant European-led culture, but it's not necessarily, you know, kind of the way that makes sense in all circumstances, you know. And so again, I bring up these characteristics just for us to start thinking about how does this show up in our day-to-day lives, and how are these characteristics really impeding our progress, impeding the way or allowing, you know, us to engage with, you know, Black and Brown people, with Indigenous folks. How are these, you know, how are these characteristics serving as barriers? And then intentionally kind of analyzing that and doing some internal work to try to break some of that down. Next slide, please. And I will say, actually, I'm also I should have said this earlier, I'm an incredibly like engaged speaker. And so if anyone has questions or, you know, is like, I don't know how I feel about that, please feel free to put it in the chat. I would love to kind of address that in real time. I love actually having those conversations. And so I welcome that feedback. And so we talk about all these characteristics, and specifically the perfectionism one, as a way to say, don't be afraid to fail. This work, equity work, thinking about equity, thinking about how to be inclusive is hard. It's relatively new for a lot of people, and we're going to make mistakes. One, we're going to make mistakes because there are a lot of different considerations to consider at the same time, and a lot of different interests to balance, right? And so we are going to offend someone at some point. I'll, you know, again, use a personal experience I just had a couple of weeks ago. Last month, for those of you that don't know, last month was Filipino-American History Month. And, you know, I do my best to engage with the people that we're celebrating just to understand what language they like to hear, what is, you know, what's important to them. And so I spoke with a couple of my colleagues who are Filipino, and they said, you know, we're really trying to get away from the gendered Filipino, Filipina. And so they said, there's a push to use Filipinx. And so in our messaging internally at CDFW, we use the term Filipinx. And so once I send out my messaging, you know, I received feedback from another colleague who, you know, kind of expressed their personal opinion and said, actually, the Filipino and Filipina is not gendered, and, you know, provided some history and some context. And so this person felt, you know, a little bit excluded and felt harmed. And, you know, had I not taken this step, I could have easily just not said anything about Filipino-American History Month. But, you know, in that moment, I offended this person and I apologized and we're able to move on. It's fine. But, you know, that can be seen as a failure, right? And so I think definitely in, you know, my department, people have been afraid to take the step because we're worried that we're going to not get it right. And I'm really here to remind us, like, don't be afraid to fail. Kind of expect that you're going to get it right. I kind of expect that you're going to make a mistake, and that's okay. And I think what we're really trying to get to is like, we are doing this in good faith. We're doing this because we want to be more expansive. We want to be more inclusive. And so we really have to kind of, you know, be a little bit, not a little bit, like be a lot humble, you know, and be vulnerable and be okay taking that step. Next slide, please. So why do we talk about equity? It's really important, I think, to talk about equity and to understand the historical context for this, because it's easy to say, yeah, you know, we have to talk to more people. But I think it's also really important to understand how different cultures may think about environmentalism, may think about conservation, because it is a different perspective. And I certainly also want to caveat this, you'll hear me caveat a lot of things because I want to make sure to convey the message that these histories, these stories are not homogenous. You know, even within cultures, you know, people have different experiences and show up differently. But I do want to provide kind of a different history than what a lot of us were kind of told as we, you know, entered into this field. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share some information that folks may or may not be aware of, but I do think it does kind of show the picture of how different cultures may think about the work that we love so much. Prior to the 1500s, there really was, you know, kind of an indigenous idea of reciprocity. Indigenous folks, and again, I'm not speaking from a homogenous way, but generally speaking, indigenous folks really lived in coordination with the land, amongst the land, and not kind of this hierarchical structure of humans on top, and we are the land, you know, we are stewards of the land, and you know, we use the land kind of as a commodity. Indigenous folks really looked at the land as a partner, right? They give to the land and the land gives back. And so it was a different ideology for kind of land stewardship. Between the 15 to 1700s is really kind of when westward expansion started to take off, colonization, you know, kind of the systemic eradication of native cultures, of indigenous folks, you know, massacres, etc. And it really kind of changed the culture and the engagement with the land and with the water and with wildlife. And that's when we see kind of buffalo bounties, right? So they were used not only to starve and kill indigenous people, but also used, you know, to sell for profit, right? So this kind of culture shift in engaging with the land. Between the 18 and 1900s, and this was actually really surprising to me, there were, I knew about the immigration quotas. So quotas to minimize, to limit the number of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, specifically from California. There were lots of efforts to kind of limit these numbers, but there were also kind of legislative attempts to specifically exclude Black people from California. So formerly enslaved folks, you know, were kind of exiting the kind of racism that they had faced on the East Coast and in the South. And we're looking to take advantage of the gold rush, for example, looking to take advantage of the opportunities that were in this unexplored, quote unquote, unexplored West. And there were legislative attempts, specifically by the leaders of the conservation movement, of the environmental movement, to exclude them, multiple attempts to keep Black people from California. And we can see that today by the low percentage of Black people that are in California. I think the last time I checked, we were about 7% of the entire population. And I thought that's really interesting, you know, these efforts from, you know, a couple of hundred years ago and looking at their impacts on the population today was really fascinating. Between the 1900s and 1930s is kind of when the conservation movement really started to take place. You know, Gifford Pinochet, Madison Grant, John Muir, all these names that we know, Woodrow Wilson, you know, they did a lot of great work to protect, quote unquote, protect the land, to conserve the land for the benefit, but specifically of white people, for specifically their peers. You know, these people also heavily advocated for ideologies like the eugenics, openly supported the Ku Klux Klan, wrote about race inferiority, right? And so while these people did really great work and really laid the foundation for kind of the work that we all engage in today, these people also have these really, really terrible kind of ideologies for non-white people. And so I mentioned this specifically because it would really be unfortunate and probably not realistic to think that some of these ideologies are not fundamentally baked into our practices for conservation, the way that we engage in land restoration, the way that we think about marine science, right? This is absolutely fundamentally baked in to our practices. I put in Fish and Game Commission because that's, you know, I work at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, but the same year, you'll see on the next slide, the same year that Madison Grant wrote a book about race inferiority and why eugenics should be practiced, was the same year that the Fish and Game Commission was established. These people were peers. These anglers were peers of, you know, kind of these racist people. And so, again, it would be silly to think that these principles are not baked into our institutions, into our systems. Throughout the 1940s and 1970s, we really kind of see the proliferation of kind of government-sanctioned racial environmental violence. So policies like redlining, for example. So redlining was a policy, and I'm not going to get too much into it because I know we have a lot to get through today, but redlining was a government-sanctioned policy to deem neighborhoods of color as undesirable. Folks of color would not get home loans. And then we see the environmental impacts of those policies today in things like urban heat islands, in things like, the lack of tree canopy. And this was a direct outcome of kind of government sanctioned environmental violence. The 1980s is when we really start seeing kind of the government recognition of the outcomes of some of these practices. And so this is really kind of the start in the environmental justice movement that was led by communities, Black and Brown communities on the East Coast, specifically in Warren County, North Carolina. This is kind of when I think most people would agree that this was really one of the first kind of nationwide, really visible protest against kind of a policy, the siting of a toxic waste facility in a Black community. This community, knew that their community would be harmed, with air pollution, soil pollution, water pollution, if this facility was placed in their community. And unfortunately it was. And even to this day, Warren County is one of the most, it's a very low income community to this day, but it's one of the most polluted counties in the nation. And the 1990s to now is when we're starting to see the slow shift of recognizing these harms and then defining equity, defining environmental justice kind of in statute to try to, one, quantify these harms, but also to try to mitigate kind of these harms. Next slide, please. So I won't spend too much time on this, but these are just a couple of photos from kind of the history that I just shared. On the left-hand side, I don't know if anyone can see my cursor, but on the left-hand side, this is Grant Madison in his book, The Passing of the Great Race. I did not think that this was actually, I really didn't think this was a real thing, but he fully wrote a whole book on why Black and Brown people were inferior and then how to eradicate them, kill them. That is the founder of the conservation movement. And then the photos in the center are photos from the environmental justice movement in Warren County, North Carolina, right? We see people literally kind of laying their lives on the line. They are laying their lives on the line to stop these facilities, and they were ignored. And they are facing the health impacts from those policies even today. And on the right-hand side is a photo of the Bracero movement. And really briefly, the Bracero movement was a policy from the government to allow Mexican nationals to work during the war, to work in agricultural fields. They were paid extremely low wages and treated terribly, worked in terrible conditions, did not receive care the way they should have. But I have this photo specifically because I don't think it's really well known that before these Mexican nationals could cross the border, they were directly sprayed. So as they crossed the border, they were sprayed all over their body with DDT. I think we all know the impacts of DDT and how toxic it can be, especially when ingested by someone. And all of these people, this is just a snapshot of a moment in time. The millions and millions of Mexicans were sprayed with this substance and faced the trauma, so the mental trauma from that, but also the physical trauma, that has, health impacts for pregnant women or women in general, that has long-lasting impacts for families of Mexican descent. Next slide, please. I really like this photo because it does a good job, I think, of visualizing kind of how detrimental how much land kind of Indigenous folks lost throughout, in a short amount of time. And so again, to just have a better understanding of how Indigenous folks feel, with this complicated history and how they may show up at the table, they lost everything, right? They were systemically, consistently murdered. They lost everything. And so again, I share this history so that we are just more aware of how complicated, one, the conservation movement is, but also just to understand and be a little bit more sensitive to how people will, you know, how they may feel about the work that we do. They may not, you know, understand it or be super excited about it. Next slide, please. And so to kind of shift the conversation a little bit, I'm going to provide just a couple of tools so to have a better understanding of how people may show up at the table. Both the federal government and the state has developed quite a few tools to have a better understanding of the cumulative environmental impacts, kind of to have an understanding of the comprehensive ways that people may show up. Again, this information is not kind of the whole story, but it does provide a better understanding of, you know, how people, you know, all the different things that people that may be on, you know, a community's minds. Next slide, please. And so these links will be available for folks after today's conference, but the federal government right here, so this is this first image on the left-hand side, the federal government developed a tool called EJ Screen. And it's a great tool to have a kind of a high level understanding of the different factors that people face. So they talk about pollution burden, for example. It provides kind of high level kind of demographic information. And so, you know, just kind of as an initial step, this is a great tool just to, you know, understand kind of a geographic region. I actually really like the next two tools that were developed by California. So the first is CalEnviroScreen, which was developed by I'm gonna try to get this acronym right. It was OEHA. So the Office of Environmental Hazard and Health Assessments is what the acronym stands for. But they developed this really comprehensive tool that looks at a handful of metrics. So pollution burden, you know, water quality issues, air quality issues, land quality issues, groundwater issues. So a lot of different environmental metrics, and then gives them kind of a score. And so what the state has done with that score is said, you know, communities are in the top 25%. So basically the most pollution burdened communities are called quote unquote disadvantaged communities. I have so many problems with that term, but that's kind of the state term that we've identified. And so these communities are subject to kind of the highest level of burdens across the state. And these communities are often allowed or targeted for kind of environmentally related benefits. And then the next tool is the Healthy Places Index. And so that one takes kind of the information from CalEnviroScreen and adds, you know, what green spaces are available? What opportunities to recreate outside, whether that be in the water or on land? What opportunities are available in these communities? And then gives them kind of a healthy index score. Excuse me. And so this score really kind of rounds out that picture for, you know, are people kind of engaged in the outdoors? Do they have access to the outdoors? And then, you know, what has that investment in the community look like? And so I encourage us, as we're looking to identify communities, you know, we'll talk about communication strategies. I encourage us to use these tools to have that better understanding. Next slide, please. So what is community? It's kind of similar to culture, right? Community can be identified, and let me back up. We use community kind of as a blanket term. And what that means is, you know, we're talking about the race or ethnicities that may be within a population, the cultures, shared backgrounds that may be within a population, the professional economic ties, what industries are in this area, what economic opportunities are in this area, what types of jobs do people do in this area? And then what are their interests? You know, what do they do when they're not working? What do people like to do? Do they fish? Do they swim? Are they hikers? You know, or, you know, do they go to their local park? And so understanding all of these different ways that people kind of come together to be a community is really helpful as we look to do community assessments, which I'll talk about next, and then kind of take those assessments to do outreach. Next slide, please. So community assessments, there's a lot going on here, and really what a community assessment is using the tools that I shared earlier to identify, understand, and then kind of make an assessment of a community. So first, the identification kind of portion is kind of looking at the geography. What's the landscape look like? Again, you can use that Healthy Places Index tool as a start, but just looking at kind of what does the landscape look like? And it also includes kind of infrastructure. Are there a lot of industrial areas, or are there a lot of is it more suburban? What is kind of the infrastructure? How are when were the homes built? Thinking about what kind of challenges may be because of this infrastructure, investment in infrastructure or lack of investment in infrastructure. Also looks at kind of demographics, and then also language. And I actually should have put language earlier because I think language is really important, especially as we're thinking about doing outreach to different communities. And then taking that information and then moving that into the understanding phase. So, when was the community founded? What was the context? What was going on when the community was founded? What's the culture? All these different ways. Again, I won't go through all of them here, but really understanding kind of the history of the community. And you can get that information by talking to community leaders, by actually engaging with people that live in these areas, with leaders, with people who really have a fundamental understanding of these communities. And then again, using both kind of the quantitative tools and then both the qualitative tools to make an assessment of how a community, what is the kind of the holistic view of this community, to understand their attitudes and their values towards whatever initiative that we're trying to talk about or develop a strategy for. Next slide, please. And so again, this is just a little bit more information for that understanding piece. I provided just a list of different people or resources that you could go to find out kind of this history. Certainly elected officials are a great resource. I really want to uplift community-based organizations because one, they are directly engaged with the people in an area. They know kind of the struggles, they know the successes, they really are intimately aware and have relationships with people on the ground. And so leveraging them as partners, schools, educational facilities, health and human services organizations, even clergy members, specifically dioceses in California. So Catholic dioceses in California are a great resource. I know in Stockton, for example, their diocese, they actually, will bring kind of environmental programs or talk about environmental programs and services with their constituents, with their members. And so really leveraging all of these different people to have a better understanding of the people that we're trying to engage with. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jules to kind of take it away from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. I was trying to take a mental screenshot of that wonderful list of people in all of our communities because it reminded me of some people that I need to maybe reach out to and re-engage. So no matter how many times we have these type of presentations, there's always a phenomenal takeaway. And that's my most recent one from your most recent slide, although we'll have to talk offline about so many things. Thank you for setting up such a wonderful foundation and framework for the entire panel. And I think going off of that concept of framework and foundation, I think that that's a great jumping off point to kind of explain the context of the slide that you're looking at, which the picture, everyone just, maybe turn your laptops to the side and it will even out there for you. Looks like my dad's falling into the water, 2 o'clock in the morning. There was just no hope of tweaking that photo. So in terms of foundational things we were talking about and setting some foundational knowledge practices in line, I want to speak to a book that we've spoken about, but I have only made it through maybe one chapter because I keep rereading it, and it's entitled As Long as the Grass Grows by Professor Dina Gilio Whitaker. And it's been transformational in my growth and healing to understand what it's like to look at life not only through an equitable lens or a Jedi lens, but through a decolonized lens, and looking at my life, my work, language, as you mentioned, relationships, environmental stewardship, which we're all here for, through a decolonized lens. So as an example, I think that the way that we introduce ourselves and the way that, you know, that the wonderful write-up that Colleen shared earlier tends to be tied into maybe, hopefully you can't hear my dog in the background right now. You might, he's coughing. Incredible timing, this guy, I tell you.
We can't hear him, don't worry.
Okay, wonderful. So the way that I would introduce myself might be from a colonized lens, and it could be awards or accolades. And I think it's helpful to provide context. Everyone needs to know, like, who are you and why are you here and what's your jam about life and what do you have to contribute? And I think that those are all helpful contexts, but it was inspirational for me to think, okay, if I'm looking at life now as a more through a decolonized lens, what does that look like as how I introduce myself? So like, who I am, is it defined by my title, the organization where I work for, which I'm grateful to work there. I work, my day job is at Wild Coast, the Outreach and Indigenous Engagement Coordinator. I run a program called the Coastal Leaders Internship for Indigenous Youth. Definitely happy to speak with anyone about that offline. And then, you know, I have my nonprofit, Coastal Defenders, and I work in the MPA Decadal Management Review, and that all gives context to the work and why we're here. But like, who am I as a person? I was up on Chumash land several months ago for, I don't know what time, several times in with my Indigenous brother Marcus, with whom I have, you know, worked with for several years, mentoring Indigenous youth. And when I met his father, there were no accolades to introduce me. There was no backgrounds about schools. There were no titles. Like, that all became immaterial and irrelevant. And how I was introduced was, what is my relationship with the water? Who my family is and who my people are, which is Nanticoke, the upper left. It means tidewater people. You know, how I view myself in relationship to the land. And I thought, like, that's so transformative. Now, I grew up doing that, you know, on my own, but I think because I was on a work trip, that juxtaposition, it just became so much more powerful to me and resonated with me, going in between. We call it an Indigenous life, like walking in two worlds, right? And so going from a place where everything is email, phone call, text, super quick responses, automatic, some sort of like trust and interaction, two-eyed seeing, thank you, yes. And it just became even more powerful. So today, thank you so much for y'all for the opportunity and the support and the safe space to just try out a new way to talk about that. So when I think of myself in relationship to the land, I think about being a protector. I protected our burial grounds at home. I did not save them from being built on. I think I saved like a couple of inches literally of land after 10 years. I saved maybe from a regional shopping center, still built houses, but you know, so protecting of the land and also in the water. And then how do we all look at our relationship with the water? And is it something when I'm coaching kids that we just get out of the car and just run into the water and that's it? Or is water actually our life source? And then how would that frame how we protect the water, or how we view marine species? And then a question that I've recently started posing to my youth is, what type of ancestor do you want to be? So it's not so much about what do you want to be when you grow up? I've changed that to maybe what type of impact you want to have on the world, but not so much like career focused. And although I advocate for access to spaces. And so things that came up for me is like, what I would want to be thought of is a person who is loving, who is kind, an ancestor who has worked to create a more just and equitable world. And instead of a curriculum vitae or a resume or like some fancy awards, I love content creation. I never have enough time to do it, but I have this like little Instagram with a few followers, and it's called Diary of a Water Protector. And I try to post some things to share and help to create community. And it is an actual diary of the work that I do. So if you would like to check it out, it's not like a follow me thing. It's more like a share thing. And these are how I capture, you know, the work that I'm doing and the love that I have for everyone and the water. Next slide, please. This slide about explaining Indigenous sovereignty could be in relationship maybe to Nicole's great slide that spoke maybe more to a concept of stakeholders, and what something might be interesting and different to comprehend for us is that Indigenous nations wouldn't fall under the concept of stakeholders necessarily, because they are sovereign. And what does that mean? And the best example that I could think of to explain Indigenous sovereignty, and specifically in this area, are the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, which means people of the long house, or people who build the house, and the fact that they travel on their own passports. When we send out, or if we've already sent out the document that has some links in it, anything that I'm talking about, I've posted these links in there so you can go on your own time and research. And another reason why I chose this sovereignty as a concept, and these Iroquois Confederacy specifically, or they're referred to as Iroquois League, 5 Nations and 6 Nations, is also because they developed what is referred to as the Great Law of Peace. The system in government was so incredible, it actually served as a basis for the United States Constitution. And when I was speaking about Iroquois people, I was speaking about what that means for their name and building of the longhouse, and thinking of, okay, if everyone is in a communal living type of situation, how does that affect perspectives of interconnectivity with one another and with our planet? A decolonized perspective might have us ask a question is, what is quote unquote wild? We're talking about wildlife. How does the concept of wild shape our thought about species, landscape, ownership, and stewardship? So I really have to thank Dina for writing this book, because Jedi practices are wonderful, but adding that component of decolonizing really has me examining interconnectivity with a lot of things, with everything in my life, and it's really been transformational in my thought process, and therefore it's really truly allowed me to have an equitable thought process to understand perspectives differently. On the right side is a photo of a woman, Joyce King. She's from St. Regis, Mohawk. So she was traveling with her passport, and it was confiscated by the Canadian government under, I referred to it as a fantasy document. And I love what she said about it. She said, if my Haudenosaunee passport is a fantasy document, I'm a fantasy person living in a fantasy land and looking at a fantasy border. So there's like a little bit of native humor there to speak to how we look at Native people. So our entire Constitution is based on this area of the people's government, yet there's issues with them traveling on their passport. When this lacrosse team went to travel to England several years ago, they were rejected from England entering into the country, traveling on their own passport. So just, and then I think that they were denied playing at the world level. And then additional level of irony, who created the sport of lacrosse, indoor stickball? Them. So whether it's the passport and the irony and recognizing sovereignty, and then we actually took our entire Constitution from these people. Additionally, they're not allowed to travel on their passport to play the sport that they invented. So that's what I mean about looking just a little bit deeper and differently to help understand some of these things we can look at from a decolonized lens. And there's some information to the left on the screen that just speaks to the generic generalized terms of sovereignty. But I thought the stories of the people are what really might help resonate, and the visuals, for anyone who can see them, help tell the story so much better than maybe just what I'm used to doing is listing out. So thank you so much. And I think that Erin is next.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jules and Nicole, for those really thoughtful presentations. And I'm just really happy to get to be part of this discussion with all of you. And so I guess switching gears a little bit, just a bit about my background, like as Colleen had mentioned in the introduction, just to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. My background is in fisheries science. I got my master's at Moss Landing and was studying the Central Coast marine protected areas right when they were getting established. And so that background in marine protection has actually carried over into my work that I'll be talking about in freshwater protection. I also have studied science communication, and so I'm really interested in communicating. And in one of Nicole's slides about worship of the written word as a writer, I'm definitely guilty of that and have been having to learn, as I'll be talking about, working in different countries and different languages, different contexts, how to adapt my communication. And so the work I'm going to be sharing today as sort of an example of trying to navigate some of these just cultural differences and nuances working in conservation and in international context is based around my work with the fisheries consulting company FishBio, where I worked for 10 years. And the work I'll be talking about is related to community-based freshwater protected areas in Laos, and also some communications work for a conservation project in Cambodia. So go to the next slide, please. So just wanted to give you a little bit of context for the area of the world where I was working. And so this is the Mekong River Basin in Southeast Asia. And you can see the countries of Laos and Cambodia, as well as Vietnam and Thailand. And so the Mekong River is a really important freshwater body, both in terms of the people that it supports, as well as the freshwater diversity that lives there from a biological perspective. So it's thought to support about 60 million people for their food, their protein, and their livelihoods. And also it's home to an estimated between 800 and 1,000 species of freshwater fish, which is about 10 times more than the freshwater diversity here in California. And so incredibly diverse river, but fisheries management is pretty decentralized and pretty limited, especially at the local level. There's a lot of responsibility that's put on local communities to actually manage the resources themselves. There aren't really very active, agencies that are out enforcing and, trying to enact sort of conservation or fisheries management practices and at the local level. And part of that is because fisheries themselves are very, especially in Laos, which is a completely inland landlocked country. So all, no marine fisheries, all the fisheries are based around freshwater, and they're usually pretty dispersed. People are fishing for subsistence. You don't have a ton of large commercial fisheries that are maybe a little bit more straightforward to regulate. So in this context, community-based freshwater protection, especially in the form of protected areas, have become a really popular fisheries management strategy. So next slide, please. So that's the work that I was involved with, and it was around the establishment of community co-managed fish conservation zones was the name for them in Laos. And these are basically, so I'm sure a lot of people on this call are familiar with marine protected areas. So this is a very similar concept, just scaled down at the local level and in freshwater. So in this case, it was in rivers. And these were areas that there's spatial protection and they're restricting or prohibiting fishing in particular areas of the river. And a lot of the times they were concentrated around deep pools that were refuges for fish when in the dry season when the water level drops. And so the deep pools were areas where fish would be concentrated. And so I think it's important to note that there is a legal framework for establishing these fish conservation zones in the Lao fisheries law. So it's basically giving communities the permission, the authority to set up these locally managed protected areas. And because of this sort of government backing and support, there are, about 1,300 or more of these fish conservation zones that are found throughout the country. And so between 2012 and 2021, I helped manage several grants that FishBio received from the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, which was to establish we established 7 of these fish conservation zones with 9 villages on the main stem Mekong River in Laos, which is, so a lot of, to date, like the protected areas had been found in smaller rivers and tributaries, and we were some of the first that were in the actual main stem Mekong River. And so the donor had, their mission is to conserve biodiversity. And so we were coming at it through the lens of trying to protect habitat for this critically endangered fish, the Julian's golden carp, which can grow to be, you know, one of the largest freshwater fish in the region. But it was highly targeted through fisheries, and we often would refer to it by its scientific name, which is probarbus. So that's a picture of the fish there on the right. So next slide, please. So in doing this work, I've had to, you know, navigate sort of different layers of cultural differences, of, you know, kind of looking at my own motivations for doing the work, and trying to think about, you know, the communities where we were actually working, because in practice, these conservation areas are meant to be, you know, it's a participatory process, and it's, you know, it's supposed to be driven by, it should be driven by the communities themselves. So we were really only working in areas where they had expressed interest in managing their fisheries in some way, and we were trying to give them these tools with which to do that. But so as I had mentioned before, you know, my training is as a scientist, and, you know, I got into studying fish because of my interest in looking at the intersection between nature and people. But my training was really around, you know, the fish side of things, and, you know, coming at things from as a conservationist. And so for the purposes of this project, you know, I also care about people and their livelihoods too, but we have this, you know, feel this responsibility of trying to protect an endangered species, of protecting biological diversity and this ecological uniqueness. You know, culturally, I am, you know, mixed race, Asian American, Vietnamese American, but in the context of working in Asia, that I'm basically an American. And that's what is, you know, kind of forming a lot of my just, you know, perceptions and my background. And so, you know, I find a lot of things, you know, culturally familiar in Asia, but I'm, you know, navigating, it's a different culture that I'm navigating. And the primary barrier to that being is that I don't speak the local language of the country where I was working. So, you know, that provides like a major challenge. Then on the other hand, with the communities themselves in Laos, so a lot of them are rural. Farming is kind of the main occupation, but there is, you know, fishing is important, but mostly for subsistence, you know, for people just to consume in their own households. And the most of the people are of the Lao ethnic majority, but there are a number of different ethnic groups in Laos, and some of the communities where we were working did have a mix of some of these different ethnic groups. So they all spoke Lao, the national language, but there were possibly other dialects in the communities as well. And you know, for these communities, fish really they're a source of food and livelihood. And there is a real interest in wanting to conserve fish, but just for, you know, different reasons than I was coming to the table with. You know, they really, in all of our discussions with the communities, again and again, they would talk about the need to conserve the fish for their future generations. They wanted there to be fish for their children to catch. And that didn't necessarily mean it had to be a particular type of fish. They weren't maybe as concerned about which species of fish. They just wanted there to be fish in the river for their children. So, you know, kind of different goals, but, you know, we're seeing how can we achieve both of these goals through the tool of freshwater conservation. So, you know, in order to effectively engage with these communities, it was really important to have just somebody from the culture to kind of be the liaison to help make the work possible. And, you know, I know Jules had mentioned this when we were planning this workshop, and might be speaking to it later, but the importance basically of engaging, you know, with members of the community with whom you're working, having them on your staff, or seeing, you know, how can they help you navigate those interactions. And so none of this work would have been possible without my colleagues in Samut, Umundi-san, who was the director of Fish Bio's work in Laos. And so, you know, he served that role as the liaison, as the translator. You know, he facilitated all of the work on the ground. But upon reflection, though, some of my colleagues and I realized that we did also make some assumptions, though, about having, Sense Move being our sort of representative of the Lao culture, and realizing that if we dig into it a little bit deeper, there might still be nuances that we have missed, because just recognizing that he has his own sort of different lenses. He's highly educated. He has a master's degree. He has a background in research. He comes from a more urban environment. He is of the Lao ethnic majority. He does speak the language, but there are, potentially different power dynamics that can come into play, and things that we might not have been fully aware of, or nuances that we might have missed. So, we're trying to do the best that we can, but realizing that, there's always, the deeper you think about things, there might be just more alternatives and things that you might not have considered. So this is just a little bit of background of doing this work. So next slide, please. And so, as I think a lot of us are familiar with in the world of conservation, we're trying to conserve, wildlife, species, but really a lot of it is around managing the behavior of people and trying to change the behavior of people. And especially with this work where we're trying to implement protected areas, this work you can go at it from a number of different angles, one of them being the top-down approach, where it's really focused on regulations and rules and punishments, enforcement. And another approach is sort of a more bottom-up, grassroots, community-based approach, where you're working with the communities and trying to get them to shift their behaviors, using other means. And so clearly there's benefits and challenges to both of these approaches. And I think it's just important to think, when we're talking about working with diverse communities, what are the impacts of some of these different approaches. So next slide. And so the work that we did, to establish these fish conservation zones, we were really good at the top-down approach. We could, because Laos had this legal framework to establish and authorize the protected areas, we could help the communities get all the paperwork that they needed to get the regulations approved at all the correct government levels, help them set up the signs, and get them to establish some kind of enforcement. And so, so from this aspect, and as a donor, we're really successful. We can get the protected area established in principle, and a lot of that though was getting, community buy-in was extremely important. But when it comes to in practice, and this is actually, it's interesting how culture plays into this. Enforcement it's actually very challenging, on the ground. To get the communities to, sort of enforce in the way that, in the ideal world, we would think, okay, if someone's breaking the rules, there needs to be some kind of, intervention and potentially, repercussions for that. But Laos is a pretty, non-confrontational culture. And, we found that there was a lot of hesitancy on the side of the community members to be confronting people who were fishing illegally, which might have been their neighbors. It could have been people in positions of power. It could have been, authorities. Like, they just didn't feel, even though they had sort of the on paper backing of the government saying, you have the authority to enforce, you set these rules, you're allowed to enforce them. In practice, it can be challenging to carry out. So next slide. And so as our work went on, I kind of realized how important it is to have this bottom-up piece in tandem, when you're doing conservation work. And I'm sure it's something that's familiar to a lot of folks here of really how do you build that local support for the work that you're trying to do? How do you get people engaged and on board with this mission? And so, we went about it in a couple of ways of trying to do that. And, the first and foremost, just having a lot of meetings, and discussions with the community, hearing out their concerns. And so that was really critical for getting the support to implement, these conservation measures. But it's also about, how do you build that ethic of conservation, and especially in an area where that's so highly depends on natural resources as resources to consume to support your livelihood. Then how do you introduce this idea of, it's how to set something aside, or to protecting fish just for their uniqueness and what they bring to the ecosystem. So we did work with schools, with kids, just talking to them about this fish that we're trying to protect, and introducing the concept of fish protection, and just trying to find those different ways of if people are how to just instill why we're doing why this conservation work is important, and what is the benefit basically to the communities themselves. Next slide, please. And so one way that we really did try to integrate local culture with the conservation activities is by connecting them to the local religious and cultural beliefs. So Laos is a Buddhist country, and historically also an animist country. So it's the idea that all aspects of nature, inanimate objects, are imbued with spirits. And so in town, like in around houses and businesses, a lot of times you will see them, they will have this spirit house, which is the picture on the left. And that is meant to be a residence for the spirit of that building. And so, you appease the spirit so that that the people living in that building can have good luck. And so we installed spirit houses for the fish conservation zones to try to signify to the community, this is a special place to be respected. And we also had ceremonies where so Buddhist monks blessed the area. And fish releasing is a practice in Laos that's meant to generate good karma. So we had, there's even a whole holiday dedicated to releasing fish in the rivers, which, from an ecological perspective can have its own challenges. But we had a fish releasing with, they're all native but hatchery fish into the river. And so these were just ways that we were attempting to integrate our work with local cultural beliefs. And I think that's it that I have for this section.
All right, so I think I'm back on here. So I'm kind of building off of Erin and Jules' presentation. We're really going to talk about the difference between outreach and engagement. And then move into kind of the importance of really diversifying your internal staff for the people that are engaging with the public. Again, understanding the historical context and the indigenous perspectives as we do our outreach and engagement. So next slide, please. So really quickly, there is a lot of work and actually a lot of kind of professional studies on how to do engagement really, really, really well. But first and foremost, there is a fundamental difference between outreach and engagement. Outreach is generally one way. So it's, me, the department, a representative of the department telling someone else, whatever I'm trying to share. It's not kind of a two-way open communication. It's also very short-term. It's also kind of as a marketing. So I'm going to say it as like a sales strategy. So outreach is more just about explaining kind of whatever your perspective is in a way to convince someone else to do something or to buy something or what have you, or to change a behavior. So again, what can one group do for the other group? I'm realizing that you can't always see my hands and because my blurred screen. And so sorry, that might be kind of weird. And what we're really trying to get to is a model of community engagement. So building relationships over a period of time, understanding, building personal relationships, thinking about how can we relate together. How can we partner to reach certain goals? And again, I'll go back to like leveraging those community leaders, right? Using those relationships so that you can get the trust, right? So building a relationship with the community leaders to build the trust of the community. Community engagement is also like, does this policy, does this initiative, does this, you know, practice or what have you actually benefit the community? So like in Erin's example about Laos, right? These people were subsistence anglers, and, you know, maybe, you know, conservation was not on the top of their mind, but is there a way to develop messaging that speaks to both, the importance of both, and also that you can have both exist at the same time? Really briefly, if I may, I will share that, you know, a lot of indigenous communities actually practice adaptive management, for example, right? And so they understood that you can't fish in the same, you know, river all the time, because then there won't be a lot of fish left. And so they would travel to different areas and then base their food, their consumption on the season and kind of what was available at the time. So instead of fishing, perhaps, you know, maybe they moved to eating nuts and berries and herbs and whatnot. And so, you know, just remembering that, you know, how do we like meet in the middle? There is a way definitely to meet in the middle. Again, connecting with people on the ground, really kind of starting with them and making sure that you have that relationship. This doesn't mean that there are not places and spaces and times where outreach is important and where outreach makes sense. But specifically, if we're trying to change behaviors, we're trying to, you know, have people think and act differently, engagement will likely get you better outcomes because you'll build that buy-in kind of from the ground up, and you will take into consideration other perspectives and kind of their needs and where they're coming to the table. Next slide, please. And so to really challenge us to go like even a step further is not just engagement, but really meaningful involvement, right? So like not just, okay, yeah, I had a meeting with this community, you know, we're going to still go off and do our thing, but providing people the opportunity to participate in the decision-making process, saying, you know, bringing people together and whiteboarding together and having them really come up with a plan. That again builds buy-in, kind of builds that trust. And also will be reflected in whatever your decision is, right? People will be able to see that their concerns are reflected in the decision and not just kind of the concerns of the government or the organization. And meaningful involvement also means that the entity, so the organization, the government, the department, what have you, goes out and actively looks to facilitate conversations with community members and really kind of does the work up front, not at the tail end, does the work up front to make sure that they have an understanding of you know, what people need and then how to engage and involve people in these conversations and decisions. So even decisions on a marketing strategy or a communication strategy, right? Like, have we talk to people and like understand like what format is better, right? Like maybe people in this community, you know, don't have broadband access, for instance. I love that one because we assume that everyone can get online, right? But even in California, we have communities that literally do not have the infrastructure to get online in a way that is like consistent, right? So it's spotty or they just don't have service at all. And so paper is better for them, or, you know, face-to-face meetings are better for them. And so if we don't do that outreach and that engagement, then we don't know that they don't have broadband access, right? We haven't done our homework. We don't know that they aren't even able to hear the message because they don't have the infrastructure to do so. And so I really want to kind of make sure that we kind of hone in kind of the difference between outreach and engagement, but also the importance of meaningful involvement, because there are, you know, different communities have different needs. And I know that I'm being repetitive, but I really want us to remember that like different people have different needs. And if we don't understand them, we're not going to be able to achieve our own goals. Next slide, please. So, you know, now what? You know, what are we talking about all this for? So there was a study done, I believe it was published in 2019. The Indiana Fish and Wildlife Department really conducted a really actually fantastic study about why people were not engaging in conservation activities, why people were not engaging in kind of their department. And I put this photo specifically because it really displays kind of a look. And so what they found in this study is that there was really a perception of the public at large of kind of, some of these activities really being exclusionary, and a perception that it wasn't a culture that people belonged in. They didn't feel like they belonged, right? People that were, they found that people that were, fishing or hunting or conservationists looked a certain way, dressed a certain way, sounded a certain way, used certain language. And the general public didn't connect with that language, didn't connect with that look, right? And so here is a photo of a hunter, right? With all the gear, the things that were supposed to look like, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but when I first started hiking, for example, I looked at other hikers and thought that I had to have the shoes and the shirts and the, sweat wicking, whatever, or I wasn't hiking. I wasn't doing hiking the right way. And so really what they found is that there was this perception that people thought that there was a right way or a wrong way to conserve, to enjoy wildlife. And I think for them, that was really insightful because, they were able to kind of dispel and educate people like there's no one right way to do this work. But the importance is to be aware of conservation and what that looks like and how human impacts really can be detrimental to species. And again, we talk about where I brought this study up because it really, I think for Indiana specifically highlighted that their inability or this perception, whether or not it was real or not, was to the detriment of their priorities and their policies, but also to the detriment of the public, right? Their health outcomes, their social outcomes, their willingness and desire to even want to go, outside and engage and recreate kind of in their outdoor spaces. And we talk about all this again to better achieve outcomes for everybody, better achieve our conservation goals, better protect wildlife, all of that, but also to better achieve outcomes for people, because ultimately we need more people. We need the people to care and to understand what we are doing, what we work so hard and diligently to do to protect, the Earth's resources. Next slide, please. And so here, I think Jules is going to take over again.
Thank you, Nicole. Nicole and I had an opportunity to, which I feel like is sometimes still rare these days, meet in person. And we were meeting at a 30 by 30 policy meeting. And as we talk about how people interact in our spaces, our coastal spaces currently, I was mentioning that I think it's always helpful for us to understand why we speak about access and share things that have happened in coastal spaces for the end goal of supporting a compassionate lens with which we can look at ways to advocate for access in coastal spaces and understanding human behavior and interaction. When I'm working on the decadal management review, one of the things that comes up for MPAs consistently is enforcement. And how do we look at the lens of enforcement, and do we, given everything that the other panelists have spoken about today specifically, do we understand relationships with enforcement, especially in coastal spaces? So what I mentioned as an example, and we were in a room of, Nicole, I'd say like maybe 30, 40 amazing humans, specifically in the outdoor experiential education field and spaces, and a variety of level of careers and things like that. I mentioned one particular way that people have interacted in coastal spaces were wade-ins, and wade-ins being protests designed to desegregate beaches. And one of the more well-known wade-ins are the Biloxi wade-ins. But if you feel comfortable, I was wondering to bring us back in an engagement. If you had heard about wade-ins or the Biloxi wade-ins, would you mind, if you would like to share, putting a reaction in the chat or hitting the reaction button? I'm not sure what it looks like on your screen, like any reaction you'd like a wave, a heart, or I always do waves of love with my kids. anything in case you had heard of that, and then like maybe I'll know how to tailor the next part. Like maybe everyone knows about wait-ins. I don't think so. Maybe because 30 to 40 of us didn't know in the space where I had an opportunity to meet Nicole. Yeah, so it maybe we don't. But there are, and again, please check out the resource list. Thank you. I see a lot of like maybe haven't heard, or thank you for, you know, us all being vulnerable in a safe space. And I put Wade in the Water and a couple other documentary. And again, this is, I don't want to narrow in on Biloxi. So my dad's Indigenous, we have African ancestry. And the reason why I do the work that I do is because my father didn't have any access to Indigenous coastal spaces. My mother does because she's not Indigenous. So it was just a juxtaposition growing up and my father not having access to our own beaches. So for the last like 10, 15, actually it's longer than that. I'm much older now, 15 to 20 years. I've been working on getting historical acknowledgements and historical signs on our beaches. And we just got them this past summer in 2022. So that's how long like this process has taken, just for additional context. I feel like I could do like my own slide about equity and coastal beaches, but this is just like one to focus on. Please feel free to look them up and then understand also like these wait-ins didn't just happen. These were over the courses of several years of planning of like hundreds of people, right? And and this is, you know, pre-email, pre-cell phones, people typing, people driving in difficult areas. And there's just a tremendous amount of organization that had to happen to get to where we are today. So I feel like one way that we can help each other have a compassionate lens and understand why we need to invest in access is we have to understand why there needed to be access to start. So understanding barriers to land and water access and how we have engaged in spaces, and then bring it back to where I'm on Kumeyaay land, and there's a wonderful organization, if you like to paddle or follow, called Paddle for Peace. And they have a wonderful Juneteenth celebration. Rissa Farrell is the founder of that. Just started, I think last year, maybe it was the first one, around the second year, going into the third year. And people at the beach, when we went into swims, flat out said, "You do not belong here. You need to leave." A variety of other things were said and still like are being said. So it's not entirely just like 100% different just because the fact that the beaches are quote unquote no longer segregated. So I share that in the context of not to just see like difficult or troublesome images and share the violence, but just to hopefully like inspire us that we can all complete our due diligence to learn more about our own homelands or other people's homelands. And then hopefully that will help us engage with people from a more compassionate lens when we talk about things like enforcement, whether it relates to wildlife disturbance or anything else. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that example, Jules. And I think, you know, we're coming at this with, you know, wanting to have people feel welcome in the outdoors and feel like they belong in spaces in nature, and have that access. And I'm seeing in the chat though also this recognition of the challenge of when we have just, you know, sheer numbers of people coming from out of an area, maybe not knowing the local history of an area, and the challenges of trying to communicate with visitors, say, in a very short amount of time. And so I don't know if I necessarily have, you know, magic answers, but in this next section, you know, we'll be talking a bit more about how can we communicate effectively, or what are ways, some things that we can be just trying to incorporate some of the cultural considerations in our communication. And then later on, we'll be talking a bit more too about how can we be, you know, shaping our our communication in order to elicit certain behaviors from the people that we're communicating with. So I like to just put this picture up as a reminder that I think, you know, we're probably all, you know, inherently know, but just to reiterate that when we're communicating, we have to take our audience, into account, and just, that a one size fits all blanket approach won't necessarily be effective. So next slide. So basically, the number one rule of communication is to know your audience. And Nicole brought this up in earlier slides of just when we're engaging with different communities and kind of trying to understand audiences from that perspective. But especially when we're trying to create materials or messaging, it's really important to clearly identify who are we trying to reach. So who is it that we're communicating to, and trying to get granular about who this population is. And so some questions to consider are, first off, how old are they? And that's just basically, are we working with kids? Are we working with adults? Or is there, it's kind of something in between? How much do they already know about the topic? And so how much, education do we have to do around certain terms, or what kind of terms we're using? Or do they have knowledge that's maybe complementary or different to what we're bringing to the table? And these are some of the things where culture can be an additional layer on top of these considerations. But what do they care about? What is important to them? And especially in relation to the topic that we're raising, and how do they get their information? Who are sort of trusted sources that they turn to? How much time do they have? That was, something that was brought up in the chat, is sometimes when it's a very brief sort of interaction with lots of visitors, you have maybe a very short amount of time to communicate your information. And then, what else? I kind of invite people to put things in the chat that, based off of what has been brought up in the workshop so far, what are other things that we should be thinking about our audience when we're trying to craft our message? Because basically, the more that we know where the audience is coming from, all of this should influence the words that we use, the style that we communicate in, the tone that we use, and also the format that we're using to communicate, just trying to meet the audience where they're at. All right, next slide, please. So this is just an example from one of the projects that I have been working on. It's a big multidisciplinary project with a lot of partners funded by USAID, called Wonders of the Mekong. And one of the goals of it is basically to kind of raise awareness and communicate the importance of sort of the natural wonders, essentially the uniqueness of the Mekong River Basin. And this project was based primarily in Cambodia. And I share the figure on the left because it's just kind of paints the picture of the social media landscape in Cambodia as of 2019. It's pretty dramatic, but there's essentially one Facebook account for every 2 people in Cambodia. It's a very, very high, everybody in the country seems to be on Facebook. So for better or worse, that was the main platform that we were using as our communication vehicle to kind of meet folks where they were at. And so I worked with Cambodian staff who did a lot of the writing of the stories or translating of stories that I and others had written. And we posted everything in 2 languages. So the Khmer, which is the Cambodian language. And then because we were trying to also reach an international audience, we posted things in English as well. And so the translation was incredibly time consuming. It made everything take twice as long to create this content, but it was absolutely critical to the work that we were doing to meet to reach the audiences that we were trying to reach. And so it was a lot of back and forth and a lot of trying to see, well, how does this term translate or not? And so I don't know if we always got it right, but it was our attempt basically to try to be as inclusive as possible with our messaging. Next slide. And I also wanted to share this paper that we put together from the project that we looked, because the project did a whole range of different types of outreach and education activities that kind of spanned the gamut from doing in-person related outreach to a lot of media-based, like social media and video and print materials. And so in this paper, we were just comparing and contrasting the pros and cons of these different approaches. And there's basically that inherent trade-off in the amount of time and effort and resources that it takes versus sort of the depth of engagement that you get with your audience. And so the in-person approaches were things like, school visits and field trips. And as I'm sure a lot of, folks on this call are familiar with, like, those present when you're working with people in person, you have that opportunity to have those in-depth two-way interactions. People can ask questions. I appreciate Nicole's point that, it's not, you can't necessarily assume that just because you're talking with another person that you are engaging with them, but you have that opportunity at least to do so. And when you are also able to bring people out into nature, then you have that ability to have some of those memorable and transformative experiences that can have a lasting impact. But as I think we're all also familiar, that those can be very just time intensive and expensive, and you reach a relatively smaller number of people. But on the flip side, when you are dealing with media, especially like social media, you can reach very large numbers of people potentially with a relatively smaller amount of effort and resources. It's not to say that these are like no effort or low effort, but it's a little bit less so than physically trying to maybe transport people, to your sites. But the challenge there being that often there is just more of this one-way flow of information, or, you can have interactions with people online, but it might be kind of more of that shallow interaction. So next slide, please. And so I think one of the programs that was probably the most successful in our work was where we tried to integrate those two approaches. And it was this Mekong Conservation Heroes program. And the goal was to spotlight the efforts of, and just inspiring Cambodians who are actually doing the work on the ground to conserve, nature and resources and wildlife in the Mekong River Basin. And so we used a mix of approaches. So there was definitely a heavy media emphasis. We had an online profile for each of these heroes. They wrote blog posts. We really tried to promote them on social media. We did an in-depth video interview biography with each of them. But we also gave them opportunities to engage with people in person. So they did school visits. We had a large outreach event where they were on a career panel. And the goal of this program was to help, it allowed people that were within the culture to be the ones who were serving as role models and also the messengers of conservation. So we were really trying to, reach and engage with Cambodians, who better to help inspire them than, their own fellow Cambodians who are actively engaged in doing this work. So, I think this program was, it was really well received, and people really, were excited, I think, to get to see just, people that look like them who were, and who were able to say that, this is why, taking care of this river is so important. All right, next slide, please. So then I guess some just final things to think about when you're crafting a conservation message. There's a lot of different ways to approach it, or different goals that we could have, and kind of depends on, well, how much time do you have to really drill into and explore these things with the community, with the group of people that you're trying to reach. But so since, we're again trying to affect people's behavior, and a lot of times that's through, there are existing rules that, that we want people to be following. At the very basic level, a lot of times the communication will just be around what are the rules? What is the behavior that we are, that are expecting visitors or community members to be following? And essentially we can't expect people to follow the rules if they don't know what they are. So sort of at a first basic level, that might be where, and if that's all the time that you have, is just figuring out a way to communicate that. But kind of hand in hand with that, is there a way that you can also be communicating to your group why the rules exist, and why are important. So just trying to help people understand that they're there for a reason, and what is sort of our ultimate goal, with trying to conserve, wildlife populations, for example. But then if you have, the ability to drill down even deeper and engage with folks is, what's in it for them? How are they benefiting by following the rules? How does this affect what they care about, or by, doing a particular behavior? And so we'll kind of come back to this too when we're talking about like the social marketing aspect of designing messaging. But these are just, some things to think about in the context of messaging. And the next slide. So I just wanted to share one brief example of when we were trying to come up with like some kind of conservation slogan for this. Is now back to the freshwater protected area work that I talked about earlier. And so we were just having some shirts made for the enforcement teams, and needed, we just wanted something to kind of capture the like the message around the work that we were doing. And so, ideally it would have been something that we would have workshopped with the communities themselves, but I think, we were at a time crunch, just had to come up with something quickly. And so my thought was to come up, I came up with 3 examples and ran them by Sinsamut, my Lao colleague, just to see what he thought about, what he thought would be the most like suitable. And so the first one is, kind of just highlighting the unique fish that we were working with, and wanting to conserve that for the future. The second one was, trying to get at just the sense of like, okay, we're all in this together about our community, it's our fish, our future. And then the last one was trying to echo that sentiment that had come up a lot with the communities about wanting to protect the rivers for future generations. And so maybe not surprisingly, he came back and told me like, yeah, the third one is probably what's going to resonate the most with the communities. And he said like the first one would be really good for our donor, I think, to like show them that, yeah, we're really, we're all about this fish. But and then it was interesting, he said like, oh yeah, we probably don't want to, if we're talking about this is our community, it's kind of setting up this like, well, it's me versus you, or like an in-group and an out-group. And, I'd never really thought about it. I thought that I was being inclusive by using that kind of language, but, maybe didn't translate quite as well. And so just, so we settled on the third one. And this is a picture of Sinsamut, wearing the shirt that we came up with. So just a little example there. And I think that's it. That's it for me.
Okay. So now that we provided all of that information, and I hope that we were able, or that you were able to kind of understand the framework here. So what, I provided kind of a broad overview and some distillation of some of the broad concepts and terms that we use. And then Jules kind of really spoke about the Indigenous perspectives, because we really feel like it was important to kind of call that out separately, because, we talk about communities as, kind of a homogenous way. But Indigenous perspectives are really kind of separate and incredibly important to consider, not in the same way that we do other communities because of the complicated history. We really wanted to call that out. And then Erin provided kind of the on the ground, real world, contextual framework and example of what this looks like in practice, how this shows up in practice. And so now we would really like to provide just some tools for how to engage and develop strategies to communicate with different people. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, and I mentioned language earlier and how I should have put it earlier on the list, language matters. First and foremost, language is incredibly cultural. And so something that means something to you may mean something can be taken, a completely different way by me. And so again, the importance of like developing and having relationships. So you understand that context. I think Erin, brought up a really good point, right? About how she didn't even think about how if we, talk about how that is a little bit of, it can be taken kind of as it's like kind of like colonized language, right? So we've created this like mine and yours in this, binary system that is incredibly European. And so, understanding those nuances, and we're not expected to know all of that, right? You are not expected to know all of that. but by engaging with different people, you'll understand that. I will also say, and I see this a lot in the work that I do, is, we're scientists, we really love the work that we do. We want to explain to people, in intricacies and details about why, conservation is important and why human behavior is important. But I think oftentimes we forget that people may not understand conservation, right? Like they may not even know what that means and what that looks like. And so using language that people really understand is incredibly important, being as simple as possible. And that doesn't mean that your constituents or your people, the people that you're trying to communicate aren't smart. They're just, their frame of reference is different than ours, right? So I'm going to tell this example. So in case you haven't noticed, I like to tell stories. It's just part of how I grew up and a part of who I am. But I do think it provides kind of good context for, maybe these nefarious or not nefarious, excuse me, kind of nebulous terms. So, oh my God, what was the story I was going to tell? I just totally lost it. Oh, that makes me super sad. Oh, shoot. Well, anyway, so I'll talk about kind of the difference between translation and interpretation. Oh, that makes me really sad. It was a good story too. So translation is kind of the written language. It's the written word. I think, there certainly can be confusion about translation and interpretation and using those words interchangeably, but translation is written language. So using paper materials, the written word, that is when you will engage with an organization or, a company that can translate materials. And then interpretation is the spoken language. So that is when you hire someone to be an interpreter to, in real time, interpret kind of the verbal word. And so I think it's incredibly important to, one, understand the difference. And so, we're looking for the right resources at the right place. And again, to understand that context. And I did provide a link on this slide about various resources for translation. As Erin said, translation can be incredibly time consuming. It normally doubles the amount of time that you need to publish your materials. And there are a handful of resources that also can be incredibly expensive. But here are a lot of resources available for us all to use. Universities can also be a great resource if we need, if funding, for example, is limited. And so, going to a language center, oftentimes students, especially graduate students, need projects. And so translating materials could absolutely serve as that. And so just thinking creatively about how to provide translation. But that also means not just providing translation, not just like automatically defaulting to like Spanish, for example. There has to be an understanding of people that may visit where we're trying to, develop communication campaigns to, have an understanding of, what they're there for, so that we can really target translating materials in that way. Next slide, please. I think that's all that I had here. Yes.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I hope that we'll have plenty of new stories to create to use for next time. Leading into Indigenous perspectives, the example that I chose to speak about, and specifically talking about language, and thank you so much for that foundational setup, where the concept of Native name reclaiming, or like as an example, like a person mentioned Bruce's Beach, another example. So by no means am I just trying to only singularly highlight Indigenous land reclamation instead of other groups, just using it as an example. And then how we can look at, again, going back to the concept of a compassionate lens and inclusive lens, and why we are advocating for access, how Indigenous folks and BIPOC possibly in general might feel about interacting in spaces with names perhaps named after people who might have committed acts of harm against them individually, collectively, and also the concept of soul and land in general. And so instead of like thinking of, I like to think of this process name reclaiming and bringing back versus just simply renaming. And then people tend to think, oh, why do we have to rename everything? And it's a part of history. I think it's just helping us return to like a homeostasis, helping us return to an accurate representation of the land. And then I look at that, what we can learn from the land. Sumag Park is a great example. And what I love in addition to this example is that there's a Yurok tribal member in this particular photo that I captured. So we're getting into not only name reclamation, but traditional ecological knowledge reclamation, and then equitable pathways for Indigenous folks. I hope it's all BIPOC as well, to reclaim their right as land and water stewards. So I love that as a great example. On Kumeyaay land, I put an example in the middle. You can, read that for yourself. And if all else fails, this is one of, I like to insert humor whenever possible. In the case of the Muir Woods Park staff, they went rogue, had some sticky notes on them, raided their supply closet, and they just addressed some, let's just say misconceptions perhaps on their own. I plan on doing something very similar when I go back to my homelands and state park signs that mention no Indigenous folks or contributions, and frame everything as in the people who came there maybe in the 60s and conserved the land, which is not the most accurate way to describe, speaking about using language for Indigenous land. So I don't know who, maybe someone's on a call, that would be amazing. But any of that, shout out to that Muir Woods park staff, pardon me, who just took it on their own until the red tape of the processes can move forward, because language does shape thought. And it is critically important to, look at how our thoughts are shaped, because then that obviously connects to action. Thank you.
All right. Well, that was amazing. I know that was a lot. It was a lot of information, but our panelists were so great and shared their own experiences, their knowledge, their history with us. And I know that I learned a lot. Personally, I think some key takeaways for myself is that communities are not homogenous. Don't be afraid to fail. And then that there are tools and resources and other groups like community-based organizations to help us do this work and get our messaging out there. And then I also think for me, the distinction between outreach and engagement, and then the next level of meaningful involvement, is really interesting. So we're gonna take a few minutes for some questions or comments or reflections, anything you'd like to share. And then we'll take a short break, and then we'll rejoin again for the breakout room session, which is going to be more of a practical applications where we'll all get to talk to each other and work through some scenarios. So in the chat, there was a lot of kind of appreciation for the panelists during their presentations. There was accolades for the equity versus equality slide. And then I think kind of most recently, the biggest question or point of discussion was, if we're talking about communities and how to best engage or outreach to them, how do we reach tourists in coastal California? That is a big population who visits our beaches and often, interacts with wildlife in the coast. And it's hard to reach them because you only have a short period of time. So I'd be interested to hear from our panelists about their thoughts on that, and from our other members here today.
I'm going to jump in real quick, and then maybe Erin can kind of follow up here if you want. I just threw you out there, Erin. Sorry. So I think for starters, you're absolutely right. It's hard to reach people when you only have a short amount of time. But I think Erin kind of touched on that a little bit. Signs can be incredibly helpful. People often generally will, look up where they're going before they go there. And so having, front and center, whatever messaging we're trying to share with them on our websites, on kind of those publicly accessible spaces, I think can be a great way Using imagery, I think, is also can be really impactful. So instead of, having a bunch of words that someone has to sift through, having images on, how to act out, in the outdoors or with species that we're trying to impact or affect or protect. So those are just a couple of ways that we can, engage with tourists, in this very compacted time frame.
Yeah, that's all excellent. I think I'll only add to that. I think it's helpful just to reflect on, I think all of us have been tourists in other places at some point in time. And I always, I live in Santa Cruz. I used to ride my bike to work across the boardwalk. And anyone who is in that area knows at a certain time of year, just because there's a lot of people walking in the bike lane. And, but I would try to just reflect back on the time that my family and I were in the Netherlands, which is also a very bike centric community. And, we're nearly mowed down because we didn't realize, oh, this colored line is a bike lane and this colored line is a pedestrian path, not a curb, but just like a line on the ground. Kind of subtle if you don't know, in that area. So I think just being able to put ourselves in that context of when you're in visiting a new place, and also, clearly tourists as a whole are not like a monolith, but there is a certain, I think, and Nicole had mentioned in the chat about like, but we can think about, well, where are they getting their information from? What's kind of their priorities? If they're there for entertainment and maybe not necessarily for education, what are ways that, quick and simple, easy ways. You could have different levels essentially for just, and sometimes there might even need to be, some kind of physical barriers to prevent people from accessing things. And then if they're for the more interested, engaged, public, you could have more detailed resources, sort of like a tiered approach. How can we just like at the outset, like, don't go into this area versus this is why we need to respect the space of these animals. You can kind of, tailor it from there.
Thank you. And I see Diana has your hand up.
Hello, and thanks for those beautiful, more extensive presentations. I'm also adding accessibility in there because it's an important thing, especially here on the peninsula. I just want to say a couple things related to a few activities that I would like everyone here to consider becoming part of. I was hosting a test program called Things to Do Monterey. It was an Alexa flash briefing really early in the market. And in my, as a stakeholder for the Convention Center and Defunct Visitors Bureau, we discussed doing an online outreach to visitors before they get here. So that is in the process of being developed now, doing a soft launch and probably stepping out more after the first of the year, 2023. So with that said, the focus on that will be to reach out to visitors and tell them why this area is special. I am going to be highlighting special focus on not just some of the history, but more about where they can go, what they can do, and why it's so special, highlighting wildlife and the natural areas. So if any of you would like to hop on and do like a short guest segment on that, we'll be doing mainly video, but to make it accessible, the idea is to put it also into audio and to transcript format. And then what I had talked about with one of the staff members previously at the Monterey Convention Center's Visitor Bureau was to get that also pushed out through their channels. They do have an app, not just the blog. So I'll throw that out there. My contact information is on the networking board. I'm known as the ARC lady, but I think the study that I did a few years back for my capstone for California Naturalists was all about the human wildlife disturbance, specifically on the Monterey Bay Peninsula. And it's, from the air down to the very depths of the sea. So if your agencies have any particular messaging or spokesperson that wants to be interviewed, any kind of specific messages, I would love to add that to the mix of everything that I'll be presenting. So thanks for that, and thanks for a lovely session as usual.
Thanks, Diana. Nicole Cropper is going to be introducing our first breakout activity after a short break, and she is on a time crunch. Are you able to hang out for another like 10 minutes or so, Nicole? Okay, awesome. So any pressing questions for Nicole before we take about a 5-minute break, or the panelists at all? And if you have anything, you're welcome to send it in the chat and we can follow up. All right, so I did want to make sure everyone sees the embedding equity resources. That is the document of all the links and resources that has been referenced throughout the workshop today. And that has all the links and resources that have been mentioned, plus some more. So it should be a view-only Google Doc that you can download and have yourself. It'll also be added to the Padlet for the entire symposium. But please make sure you get to that, and we'll also probably try and send it in a follow-up email. So we will take a short break, 5 minutes. So let's be back at 11:07, if that works for everyone. And then we'll get started on our practical applications. Thanks all. For those of us who are trying to figure out the breakout rooms, I think it'll be easier to just talk about it out loud. No one else listened to us figure this out.
Hi guys. Sorry. I'm trying to put the breakout rooms, and hi Andy, I just saw your message too. Yeah, you might know this answer. I have the 6 breakout rooms. I know who is supposed to be facilitating. What's very interesting is that everyone is available and there for me to put them into rooms except Colleen and myself. And we're supposed to be facilitating a room. And my confusion, it might be because Colleen's the host, and it might be because I'm trying to make a breakout room. But I've never dealt with this before. So I was wondering if either Nicole or Andy, you've ever had this happen to you?
I think you're able to join separately as opposed to being assigned to one.
Okay, so
you can just choose the one you want to join.
I can. Okay. So
maybe
then I'll
you can assign each other to breakout groups.
Well, so I can assign everyone but Colleen. Colleen, her name's just not there, and my name's not there. I would love to find out if someone can just add me or Colleen into the rooms.
Interesting. Yeah, you should be able to just join your own breakout room once.
I think from my recollection of doing this before, I think you can just join. The host can just like pop in whenever to any room.
Okay, good. So then, Colleen, I'm going to send you a number, and I'll take a number, and then you'll just know which one of the rooms that you're going into. Okay. Everyone else is already assigned, so you will automatically be put in there.
Sorry, I just stepped out to go to the restroom. Could you say that again, Heather?
So I was trying to make breakout rooms, but you and I are not on the list to assign rooms. So I'm going to just message you a room number. So you're going to automatically choose that room number.
Oh,
and I'm going to hope that solves this problem.
Okay.
Everyone else, however, has been assigned a room, and it will automatically take you when I hit open rooms.
Got it.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.